What happens when a CEO steps into his own factory and realizes everything is falling apart? Logan Carter built his manufacturing empire with a vision of fairness and integrity. But when whispers of worker mistreatment and unsafe conditions reached him, he decided to see the truth for himself. Going undercover as a factory worker, he uncovered exploitation, unfair wages, and a ruthless management team crushing employee morale. What he did next changed everything. This is the story of how one CEO tore down a broken system and rebuilt it from the ground up. Stay tuned, this is leadership at its most raw and real. Logan Whitaker sat in his sleek corner office, staring at the latest report from the Westbridge manufacturing plant. On paper, the factory was performing well. Production quotas were being met, costs were under control, and revenues remained steady. But buried beneath the numbers was a different story. Employee turnover was at an all-time high, safety complaints were surfacing with increasing frequency, and customer service ratings had plummeted. Worse yet, rumors of wage theft and abusive management had begun trickling through the ranks. Workers were leaving mid-shift, and complaints about unpaid overtime and toxic leadership were growing louder. When Logan questioned his executive team, they brushed it off. Every business has complainers, Brent Holloway, the factory's long-standing supervisor, had said. You give people too much, and they still want more. His words left a bad taste in Logan's mouth. He had built Whitaker Manufacturing on the foundation of fairness and respect, believing that a company's greatest asset was its workforce. Yet the very employees he had promised to protect were suffering under his watch. Logan couldn't ignore the signs any longer. He had spent years making decisions from a distance, relying on reports and managerial updates to gauge the health of his company. But numbers didn't tell the full story. People did. He needed to see the truth for himself. So he made a decision. Without alerting his corporate team, Logan would go undercover as a factory worker. He would trade his tailored suits for steel-toed boots and step onto the factory floor as Luke Wallace, a new line worker. If there was corruption, he would expose it. If his employees were suffering, he would find out why. This wasn't just about saving a factory, it was about saving the company's values before it was too late. Tomorrow, Logan would no longer be the CEO, he would be one of them. And for the first time in years, he had no idea what he was walking into. The next morning, Logan Whitaker, now Luke Wallace, stepped through the rusted gates of Westbridge Manufacturing Plant. The factory loomed before him, an aging structure of concrete and steel, its faded logo barely visible on the exterior wall. The air smelled of metal and grease, a sharp contrast to the climate-controlled boardrooms he was used to. Dressed in a faded work jacket, worn-out jeans, and steel-toe boots, Logan adjusted the cap that helped obscure his face. No one looked twice at him. To them, he was just another new hire. Inside, the factory was a mechanical symphony of controlled chaos. Conveyor belts rattling, machines stamping and welding, workers moving in a synchronized flow, but beneath the hum of industry, Logan sensed something was off. The atmosphere was tense, the workers' faces tired and impassive. There was no camaraderie, no casual conversation, just silent, mechanical labor. A stocky man with a clipboard, Glenn Dawson, the shift supervisor, approached him with a skeptical glance. "You're the new guy?" he grunted. Logan nodded. "Yeah, Luke Wallace. First day." Glenn barely acknowledged the introduction before shoving a pair of heavy gloves at him. "No time for chit-chat, you're on line 6. Keep up or you're out." Logan followed him to the assembly line, where workers were assembling metal parts at a grueling pace. He was thrown into the work with no real training, just a vague instruction to watch and do. It took him only minutes to realize that safety protocols were being ignored. Machines lacked proper guards, workers handled heavy materials without assistance, and the heat from the equipment made the air thick and suffocating. A young worker next to him, Miguel, wiped sweat from his brow, glancing around before muttering, "Better keep moving, man. Glenn's watching." Logan followed Miguel's gaze. Glenn stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes scanning for any sign of slacking. Whenever a worker slowed down, his voice cut through the factory like a whip. "Pick it up, or you'll find yourself out of a job." Logan clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a demanding workplace. It was a pressure cooker, pushing people to the breaking point. He hadn't been on the floor for an hour, yet he already saw the cracks in the foundation. Westbridge wasn't just broken, it was crumbling. By his second day at Westbridge Manufacturing, Logan had already felt the weight of exhaustion settling in his bones. The relentless pace of the assembly line left no room for breaks, no time to catch a breath. But what troubled him more than the physical demands was the defeated silence of his coworkers. No one laughed, no one talked unless necessary. It was as if life had been drained from them. Determined to understand more, Logan struck up a conversation with Miguel, the young man who had warned him on his first day. They sat together during the brief lunch break, huddled over their sandwiches in the dimly lit break room. "How long have you been here?" Logan asked, keeping his voice casual. Miguel let out a humorless chuckle. 3 years. Feels like 30. He took a sip of water before adding, "They don't care about us, man. Just numbers on a sheet. You get injured, too bad. Fall behind, you're gone." As if on cue, James, an older worker with graying hair and grease-stained hands, chimed in. "It wasn't always like this," he muttered. "Used to be a good place, decent pay, benefits. Then new management came in, started cutting corners, pushing quotas. Now, we're barely making a living." Logan frowned. "You mean Glenn?" Miguel shook his head. "Glenn's a jerk, but he's just following orders. The real problem is higher up, Regional Manager Rick Carter. He's the one slashing hours, denying overtime pay, and pushing quotas through the roof." James nodded. "They tell us there's no budget for raises, but Rick just got a new company car. Makes you wonder." Before Logan could respond, a commotion broke out near the loading dock. A worker, Angela, had dropped a heavy box, her hands trembling from exhaustion. Glenn stormed over, his voice laced with fury. "You think we have time for screw-ups? That's coming out of your paycheck." Angela's face paled, but she didn't argue. Logan clenched his fists, feeling anger coil in his chest. Docking wages for accidents? That wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Miguel exhaled sharply. "See? That's how it is. You speak up, you lose your job. No one's safe." Logan had come to Westbridge expecting management inefficiencies, but what he had found was far worse. This wasn't just bad leadership, this was exploitation. And now he had the proof he needed to take action. As the days passed, Logan saw the true cost of working at Westbridge Manufacturing, and it wasn't just exhaustion, it was fear. The factory floor wasn't just a workplace, it was a pressure cooker, where every mistake had consequences, and every worker walked on eggshells. One afternoon, while stacking inventory in the warehouse, Logan overheard a heated argument between Glenn, the floor supervisor, and Darius, a middle-aged machine operator. Darius had been struggling with one of the older machines, its gears slipping, causing production to slow. "I've told you this thing needs maintenance," Darius pleaded, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's not safe, Glenn. The gears are loose and the belt keeps catching. Someone's going to get hurt." Glenn sneered. "We don't have time for complaints, Darius. You're here to work, not whine. If you can't handle it, maybe you don't belong here." Darius clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists, before he exhaled sharply and turned back to his machine. Logan could see the rage and helplessness in his expression. He wanted to fight back, but he couldn't. Not if he wanted to keep his job. Later that evening, while sweeping near the break room, Logan heard Angela, the woman who had dropped the box earlier, speaking in hushed tones with Samantha, another worker. "They cut my hours again," Angela murmured, voice trembling. "I worked 38 hours last week, but my paycheck says 32. Samantha nodded grimly. "They do it to all of us. Claim it's a payroll glitch, but somehow it only ever works in their favor." Logan's grip tightened around the broom handle. Wage theft. It wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. The more he listened, the clearer the pattern of abuse became. Injuries weren't reported because workers feared retaliation. Quotas were impossible to meet, yet failure resulted in cut hours. Overtime was promised, but the extra pay never materialized. Employees were treated as disposable, replaceable cogs in a machine that only valued profit. And Rick Carter, the regional manager, had built the entire system on this foundation of fear. Logan had seen corporate greed before, but this was different. This was exploitation at its worst. As he looked around at the tired, defeated faces of his coworkers, Logan made a decision. This couldn't continue. He wouldn't let it. The factory wasn't broken because of inefficiency. It was broken because of those in power. And now he was going to bring it all crashing down. Logan had seen enough. He wasn't just witnessing mistreatment, he was living in the middle of it. But if he wanted to take down Rick Carter and the corrupt management at Westbridge Manufacturing, he needed more than just stories. He needed proof. Over the next few days, he carefully documented everything. He took notes on wage discrepancies, the unsafe working conditions, and the threats supervisors used to silence employees. He memorized shift schedules and compared them to actual pay stubs, confirming that hours were being stolen. Workers like Angela and Darius weren't exaggerating. They were being cheated. But it wasn't until one night shift that Logan truly hit his breaking point. It was late, well past the scheduled end of his shift, but Glenn had ordered him to stay and clean up an oil spill near the conveyor belts. Most of the factory had cleared out, leaving only a handful of exhausted workers scrambling to finish last-minute quotas. Then, it happened. A sharp scream cut through the noise of the machines. Logan whipped around just in time to see Darius collapse beside his machine, his hand clenched around his shoulder. The belt had snapped, sending metal shards flying. One of them had sliced through Darius's sleeve, leaving a deep gash across his arm. Blood seeped through his shirt as he groaned in pain, clutching the wound. Logan rushed forward, along with Angela and another worker. "We need to get him to a hospital," Angela cried, looking around for help. But Glenn was already there, standing over them with cold indifference. "Clock him out and get him out of here," he said flatly. Angela's face contorted in disbelief. "What? He's hurt. He needs stitches." Glenn crossed his arms. "If he goes to a hospital, we have to report it. That means paperwork, questions, problems. So unless you want to lose your shift next week, I suggest you shut up and do as I say." Logan's hands curled into fists. This wasn't just exploitation anymore. This was endangering lives. And the worst part? It had happened before. He could see it in the way the other workers reacted, not with shock, but with resignation. This was normal for them. But it wouldn't be normal for much longer. That night, Logan took his phone and typed a single message to a trusted contact outside the factory. "I have proof. We need to act. Now." Logan had spent weeks watching, listening, and gathering evidence, but the time for silence was over. It was time to act. Armed with payroll records, photos of unsafe conditions, and even a recording of Glenn threatening injured workers, Logan walked into the factory the next morning, not as a low-level temp, but as the owner of Westbridge Manufacturing. As he stepped onto the factory floor in his usual tailored suit, the reaction was immediate. Workers stopped mid-tack, their eyes widening in disbelief. Some whispered in shock, while others, like Angela and Darius, stared at him, realization dawning. They had trusted him as one of them, and now they were seeing him for who he truly was. But Logan didn't have time to explain, not yet. He had business to handle first. He walked straight into the supervisor's office, where Brent Walker, the factory's general manager, sat comfortably at his desk, sipping coffee. Beside him, Glenn and a few other supervisors smirked, clearly unaware of what was coming. Logan Carter? Logan Carter. Brent's brows furrowed as he glanced up at Brent. Logan Carter. Brent's brows furrowed as he glanced upward. Logan Carter? Brent's brows Logan's calm expression never wavered as he dropped a thick folder of documents onto Brent's desk. "Actually, Brent, the real question is, what the hell have you been doing?" Brent glanced down at the papers and paled. Inside were copies of falsified payroll records, evidence of stolen wages, and a full report on the factory's dangerous conditions. But Logan wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With the press of a button, Glenn's voice filled the office. "Clock him out and get him out of here. If he goes to the hospital, we have to report it. That means paperwork, questions, problems." Glenn's face went ghost white. Logan turned to Brent, his tone like steel. "You let this happen under your watch. You let people suffer while you padded your budget to make yourself look good." Brent tried to recover, his voice weak. "Look, Logan, we can fix this." "No," Logan cut him off. "You're fired. All of you." Security, already waiting outside, stepped in. As Brent and his cronies were escorted out in disgrace, Logan turned to face the factory's workers. They weren't just watching, they were hoping. It was time to fix what had been broken. With Brent and his corrupt supervisors gone, Logan knew that firing them was only the first step. If Westbridge Manufacturing was going to survive, he had to rebuild it from the ground up, not just in terms of management, but in trust, fairness, and respect. The first order of business was correcting wages. Logan brought in an independent auditing team to go through months of payroll records. Within days, workers who had been shorted on their paychecks received full compensation. Some employees stared in disbelief when they saw their corrected wages, money they had given up hope of ever seeing. Next, he tackled the inhumane scheduling. Instead of unpredictable shifts that left workers scrambling to balance their lives, he introduced a transparent, rotating schedule that ensured fair working hours. No more unpaid overtime, no more sudden cuts to force employees below full-time status. Workers now knew exactly when they'd be working, giving them stability they hadn't had in years. But fixing policies wasn't enough. Logan had to fix the culture. To do that, he promoted Angela, the floor supervisor who had risked her job speaking out, to head of operations. She had always been the one employees turned to when they needed help, and now she had the authority to make real changes. Darius, the young father Logan had worked alongside, was offered a training supervisor position with a pay raise and benefits. The biggest change, however, was the introduction of an employee advisory council, a group of factory workers elected by their peers to bring concerns and ideas directly to Logan's leadership team. For the first time, the people who actually worked the machines, packed the shipments, and handled production had a voice in company decisions. Logan also revamped the safety measures. The faulty machines Brent had ignored, repaired, or replaced, the emergency procedures that had been glossed over, rewritten and enforced. When he walked the factory floor, he wanted his workers safe and protected, not expendable. At first, employees were skeptical. They had heard promises before, but as the weeks passed and they saw real change, paychecks arriving in full, managers actually listening, schedules becoming manageable, hope returned, workers who had planned to quit decided to stay. Productivity rose, not because of fear, but because people finally felt valued. One afternoon, Logan walked through the factory and heard something he hadn't heard in a long time: laughter. It was then he knew Westbridge Manufacturing wasn't just surviving. At first, the changes felt too good to be true. After years of mistreatment, the workers at Westbridge Manufacturing had learned not to expect fairness. They had seen managers come and go, each promising improvements that never came. But this time something was different. Logan Carter was still there. Instead of disappearing into a corporate office, Logan walked the factory floor daily, talking with workers, asking about their concerns, and, most importantly, listening. Employees weren't just being told that things would get better, they were seeing it with their own eyes. Paychecks were accurate, shifts were predictable, and supervisors no longer ruled with intimidation. One of the biggest turning points came when the first Employee Advisory Council meeting took place. Workers gathered in the newly renovated break room, no longer a cramped, neglected space, but a comfortable, welcoming area. Angela, now head of operations, stood at the front and addressed them not as a superior, but as an equal. "For years we had no voice. That changes today," she said. For the first time, employees openly discussed their experiences without fear. They brought up concerns about workflow inefficiencies, requested better training programs, and even suggested ways to increase production without exhausting workers. And instead of their ideas being dismissed, Logan and his leadership team took notes, asked follow-up questions, and promised action. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight, but this was the moment when workers began to believe again. One evening, as Logan prepared to leave, Darius approached him with a hesitant smile. "You know, when you first showed up, we thought you were just another suit. But you actually meant it." Logan smiled, knowing that was the greatest success of all. Westbridge Manufacturing wasn't just fixing its numbers or policies, it was healing. And for the first time in years, its workers had hope. Before going undercover, Logan Carter thought he understood leadership. He had spent years in corporate offices, analyzing spreadsheets, reviewing reports, and making decisions from a distance. He believed that as long as profits were strong, the company was thriving. But after walking the factory floor, working alongside exhausted employees, and witnessing their struggles firsthand, he realized how far removed he had been from the reality of his own business. The experience had humbled him. Leadership wasn't just about making tough decisions. It was about being present, about ensuring the people who actually built the company's success were valued, heard, and treated with dignity. He had spent years trusting middle management to enforce policies, assuming they would act in the best interest of the workers, but blind trust had allowed exploitation to flourish. Through conversations with employees like Angela and Darius, Logan learned that leadership isn't about power, it's about responsibility. He had the power to make decisions that affected thousands of lives, but until now he had never truly understood the weight of that responsibility. He saw it in the faces of workers who had spent years underpaid, in the way they flinched when supervisors walked by, in their resigned acceptance that this is just how things are. That realization changed him. He no longer saw his employees as numbers on a payroll report, but as people with families, dreams, and struggles. Instead of sitting in an office all day, he made it a priority to spend time on the floor, speaking with workers, ensuring that their concerns weren't just acknowledged, but acted upon. More importantly, Logan embraced a new kind of leadership, one built on trust, transparency, and accountability. He created direct reporting lines for employees to reach corporate, ensuring that no future complaints could be buried by corrupt middle managers. He personally oversaw wage adjustments and fair scheduling policies, and he implemented a mandatory program requiring all executives to spend time working on the factory floor each year, ensuring that no future leader would make the same mistake he had. Looking back, Logan realized that going undercover hadn't just saved his company, it had saved him from becoming the kind of CEO who lost sight of the people who mattered most. He had stepped into the world he built and almost lost it, but in the process, he had become the leader his employees truly deserved. Months after Logan Carter's undercover mission, the factory was no longer the place of exhaustion and fear it once was. The changes he implemented, fair wages, better working conditions, and ethical management, had transformed both the workplace and its people. Employees no longer walked in with slumped shoulders and wary eyes. Instead, they greeted each other with renewed energy, knowing their voices finally mattered. The most noticeable difference was trust. Workers who once feared speaking up now had direct lines of communication with upper management. Employee meetings weren't just for show, they became platforms where real issues were discussed and addressed. Supervisors who abused their authority were replaced with leaders who valued teamwork and fairness. Productivity improved, but not because workers were being pushed harder. Instead, with fair pay, reasonable hours, and proper training, they were able to do their jobs without the constant stress of being overworked and underappreciated. Customers noticed the difference too. Order fulfillment was faster, product quality was higher, and complaints had significantly decreased. Standing in the newly renovated break room one evening, Logan watched as workers laughed and shared a meal, something that had been rare before. This wasn't just a company recovery, it was a rebirth. Logan had come to the factory to fix a business problem. What he discovered was a leadership failure that nearly destroyed everything he built. But through accountability and action, he had not only restored the factory, he had restored its people's faith. As he walked the factory floor, shaking hands, listening to employees, and seeing the company he had envisioned finally come to life, he knew one thing for certain: this was the kind of legacy worth building. The story of Logan Carter's undercover journey in his own factory highlights a fundamental truth about leadership. A company is only as strong as the people who keep it running. Logan once believed that profitability and efficiency were signs of success. But when he stepped into the shoes of his workers, he discovered the harsh reality: a toxic workplace where employees were undervalued, overworked, and afraid to speak up. His experience taught him that true leadership isn't about sitting in a boardroom and reading reports. It's about being present, listening, and taking action. A leader must not only set high standards but also create an environment where employees feel safe, respected, and motivated. Logan learned that neglecting the workforce for the sake of cutting costs and maximizing profits only leads to resentment, low productivity, and eventual failure. By taking responsibility and implementing real change, Logan didn't just save his company, he saved the people who had been struggling in silence. The story reminds us that ethical leadership, fairness, and accountability are what truly sustain a business. In the end, profit is important, but a thriving workforce is what truly makes a company strong and enduring.